It was just past dawn when Officer Ryan Calloway stepped into Cell Block C for morning roll call. The prison was still in that strange, in-between state, some inmates beginning to stir, others lost in restless sleep, and the guards swapping their shifts, eager to clock out. Calloway was exhausted, running on nothing but stale coffee and muscle memory, his last shift bleeding into the next. But something was off. The door to the block, a heavy steel barrier meant to stay locked overnight, was slightly ajar. That wasn't protocol. Prison security was airtight. No door was ever left open unless someone wanted it that way. As he approached, his boots echoed against the concrete, the dim fluorescent lights overhead flickering. The air was thick, humid from the bodies stacked in their cells. But there was something else, a metallic tang in the air, sharp and pungent. Then it hit him. The stench of blood. Calloway froze. His stomach twisted in an instinctive response, one that had taken years to hone. He knew what blood smelled like. He'd broken up more prison fights than he could count. But this was different. It was stronger, fresher. A few more steps, and then he saw it. Officer Daniel Reese lay sprawled on the cold concrete floor. His body was twisted at an unnatural angle, arms limp at his sides, his head cracked open like a dropped melon. Blood seeped from the deep wound at the back of his skull, pooling beneath him, the dark crimson soaking into his uniform. His badge was missing. His radio was gone. His gun was still holstered, untouched. Calloway's breath hitched. His fingers fumbled for his radio, the device feeling heavier than usual in his grip. "Officer down!" His voice cracked. "Officer down in Cell Block C. We need backup now." Silence. A beat of dead air, and then movement. A shuffle from behind. Calloway's heart slammed against his ribs. He spun around, hand on his holster, eyes scanning the dim corridor. Nothing. The air hung still. The silence was so thick it felt alive, pressing against him, suffocating. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. And now they are gone. The air inside Ironwood State Prison was thick with tension when Detectives Sarah Vale and Eric Donnelly stepped through the main entrance. It wasn't just the heat pressing in from the sun-baked concrete walls. It was the eyes. Every uniformed officer, every administrative clerk, even the inmates stealing glances from their cells, watched them with a quiet, unsettling hostility. Vale noticed it immediately, the kind of reaction that didn't come from grief over a fallen colleague, but from fear. Or worse, guilt. A dead correctional officer was big enough news, but a dead officer inside the prison. That meant one thing: someone on the inside did it. The two detectives were escorted past the barbed wire fences and steel gates, their badges checked twice before they were allowed anywhere near Cell Block C. As the doors clanged shut behind them, Donnelly murmured, "Feel that?" Vale nodded. "Yeah, they're scared of something. Or someone." Inside the block, the crime scene was still raw. The blood had been cleaned up, but a dark stain on the concrete showed exactly where Reese had fallen. Officers walked past quickly, avoiding eye contact, like ignoring the spot would make them forget what had happened. The forensics team was already working, combing through evidence, but there wasn't much to find. The security cameras covering Cell Block C had been manually disabled exactly 30 minutes before Reese's death. No footage, no recordings. Someone had planned this. The murder weapon, a standard issue baton, had been found in a janitor's closet, wiped clean. No prints, no DNA. Reese's locker had been ransacked, but nothing valuable had been taken. His wallet, his gun, even his keys were untouched. But his notebook, the one he always carried, full of his personal notes, was missing. "Whoever did this wasn't looking for money," Donnelly said, flipping through the evidence logs. "They were looking for something specific." Vale crouched by the bloodstain, running a gloved hand across the cold floor. Or covering something up. They started with Officer Ryan Calloway, the one who had found the body. He sat stiffly in the break room, his hands clasped together, eyes locked on the table in front of him. His uniform was still slightly wrinkled from the long shift, a coffee untouched at his side. Vale sat across from him. Donnelly leaned against the wall. No one spoke at first. Just the sound of the old wall clock ticking above them. "Tell us about Reese," Vale finally said. Calloway exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. "Reese was a good man," he said, his voice hollow. "Kept his head down, did his job. He didn't deserve to go out like that." "You say he kept his head down," Donnelly interjected, arms crossed. "Then why was his locker torn apart? Why was his notebook missing?" Calloway's jaw tensed. A flicker of something in his eyes. Hesitation. He was holding back. "I don't know," he said, too quickly. Vale leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Calloway, we're not here to pin this on you. But we know Reese was looking into something before he died. Something big. Was he asking questions?" A beat of silence. Then finally, Calloway swallowed hard. "Yeah," he admitted. He thought something was off. He started noticing contraband getting through that shouldn't have been possible. Drugs, cell phones, stuff that wasn't just slipping through the cracks. It was being let in. Vale exchanged a look with Donnelly. That meant one thing: dirty guards. Calloway glanced toward the door, lowering his voice. "Listen, I don't know much, but I know one thing. Reese was getting close to something, and now he's dead." Before Vale could press further, the door swung open. Officer Carla Mendez stepped in. Mendez was tall, sharp-eyed, and wound tight. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her black hair pulled into a strict bun. But Vale noticed the way she kept flexing her fingers, the way her jaw clenched too hard when she thought no one was looking. This was a woman under pressure. Vale wasted no time. "Officer Mendez, you worked closely with Officer Reese, correct?" Mendez nodded. "Yeah, he was my partner on most shifts." "Did he mention anything about what he was investigating?" Mendez hesitated. A half-second too long. Then she shook her head. He didn't tell me anything." Donnelly stepped forward, his voice casual. "Funny. Calloway just told us Reese was digging into a contraband ring. You sure you didn't know about that?" Mendez's eyes flickered, just for a second. But it was there. "I didn't say I didn't know about the smuggling," she corrected, voice tight. "I said Reese didn't tell me anything." Donnelly raised an eyebrow. "Because he didn't trust you?" Mendez bristled. "I don't know. Maybe." Vale leaned in. "Mendez, we'll find out the truth one way or another. You were his partner. If you know something, now's the time to say it." Mendez's hands curled into fists. Then finally she exhaled sharply. "Fine. Look, Reese was, getting too involved in things that weren't his business." She shot a glance at the door. "That's all I'll say." She stood abruptly. "I have rounds to make." And with that, she walked out. Vale and Donnelly watched her go. Donnelly let out a slow breath. "Well, that wasn't suspicious at all." Vale nodded. She knows more than she's saying. Their last stop was Warden Frank Salazar. His office was the only part of the prison that didn't feel like a prison. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, a well-stocked liquor cabinet in the corner. The man himself was in his 60s, gray-haired but sharp-eyed, his uniform adorned with medals from decades of service. "Detectives," he greeted smoothly, "I assume you have questions." Vale wasted no time. "Warden, do you have any explanation for why Reese was looking into contraband smuggling before his murder?" Salazar barely blinked. "I wasn't aware of any such investigation." Donnelly smirked. "Right. Just a coincidence that one of your best officers ended up dead right when he started asking questions." Salazar sighed. "I understand how this looks, but Ironwood is a tough facility. These things happen." Vale narrowed her eyes. "You're saying his murder was gang-related?" Salazar nodded. "It's the most logical conclusion." It was a rehearsed answer. Too clean, too prepared. As they left, Donnelly muttered under his breath, "He's hiding something." Vale nodded. "Yeah, and I think we just found our first real lead." Just as they were about to leave, a voice called out from a nearby cell, "Hey, detectives, They turned. Inside, leaning casually against the bars, was Julius J. Rock Carter, a lifer covered in tattoos, a knowing smirk on his face. "I heard Reese arguing with someone that night," he said lazily. Vale stepped closer. "Who?" J. Rock grinned. "One of them sounded just like you, Detective." Vale felt her stomach drop. Who the hell had Reese been talking to before he died? Officer Daniel Reese had been trying to get someone to listen. That much was clear. A fellow officer told them that in the weeks leading up to his death, Reese had filed multiple requests for a private meeting with Internal Affairs, a move that suggested he had something big, something he didn't trust anyone inside Ironwood State Prison to handle. But the meeting, it had never been scheduled. Officially, there was no record of his requests, no paper trail, no digital footprint. It was like he had never even tried. But Vale and Donnelly had seen this kind of thing before. Someone had buried it. And that meant someone with power. Someone who wanted him silenced. Back at the prison administrative offices, Vale and Donnelly were given access to Reese's desk and personal locker. It was clean. Too clean. There were no handwritten notes, no reports, no loose files. Most officers kept some sort of personal system. Sticky notes, printouts, reminders of cases they were tracking. But Reese's space was almost sterile. Except for one thing. Stuffed in the back corner of his desk drawer, wedged between a stapler and an old case file, was a folded napkin. At first glance, it looked like trash. Something easily overlooked. But when Vale unfolded it, she saw numbers scrawled across it in blue ink. A phone number? Coordinates? A combination? They weren't sure yet. And beneath them, two simple letters, LK, no explanation, no context. But Vale had been in the job long enough to know that victims don't hide meaningless things. This napkin meant something. And whatever LK stood for, it was important enough for Reese to write down but not leave in the open. That night they went to Reese's apartment. It was a small second-floor walk-up in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. A place that didn't stand out. A place that didn't attract attention. Except tonight, something was wrong. As soon as Vale stepped out of the car, she noticed it. The front door was open, not wide, just slightly, enough for the lock to catch, enough to look normal unless you were paying attention. She and Donnelly exchanged a look before drawing their weapons. Donnelly went in first, moving low and fast, clearing each corner as they entered. The place was dark, but moonlight from the windows cast jagged streaks of silver across the floor. And then they saw it. The apartment was trashed. Drawers yanked open, papers scattered across the floor, the couch cushions sliced open, as if someone had been desperately searching for something hidden inside. The kitchen cabinets were flung wide, the refrigerator door left ajar. This wasn't a burglary. This was a search, a targeted, methodical search. Someone had been here recently. And whatever they were looking for, they wanted it badly. Donnelly moved toward the small wooden desk by the window. Unlike the rest of the apartment, the desk was relatively untouched, except for the laptop sitting in the center. The screen was still on, the glow casting an eerie light in the wreckage of the room. Whoever had broken in had left in a hurry. Donnelly slid into the chair, tapping a key. The laptop woke up instantly. Reese hadn't logged out. The screen displayed a list of guard schedules, meticulously compiled, each officer's shifts highlighted in different colors. Most of it was routine, but one name stood out: Jack Lasky. His name appeared twice, marked in red. Vale's pulse quickened. Lasky. Could it be LK? They didn't have time to process before something crashed in the alley behind them. Both detectives spun toward the window. Vale rushed forward, peering down into the darkness. A figure was running, a shadow darting between dumpsters, disappearing into the night. Whoever had broken in, they hadn't gotten what they wanted. And now they knew someone else was looking too. The walls of Ironwood State Prison had always held secrets. Some were whispered between inmates during late-night lockdowns. Others were passed through envelopes slipped under doors. But the most dangerous ones? Those were the secrets kept by the guards themselves. Jack Lasky had been part of the system for years. A veteran officer with a spotless record, the kind of man who never made waves, never got involved in anything that wasn't his business. He followed orders, kept his head down, and in a place like Ironwood, that meant one of two things. Either he was clean, or he was so deep in the dirt that no one had ever dared to drag him out. Vale and Donnelly found him in the break room, sipping a coffee like nothing was wrong. He barely glanced up when they entered, his expression unreadable. "Detectives," he greeted smoothly. "Something I can help you with?" They took him in without incident. No argument, no resistance. Lasky just sighed, set down his cup, and followed them to the interrogation room without a word. That was the first red flag. Men like Lasky didn't fold easily. They didn't panic, not unless they already knew something was coming. Inside the interrogation room, Lasky sat with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He was a man who had spent years behind these same walls, just on the other side of the bars. He knew how this game was played. At first he gave them nothing. He didn't know why Reese had been investigating contraband. He had no idea why Reese's name had been linked to internal affairs. Didn't know why his own shift schedule was highlighted on Reese's laptop. But then Vale asked the right question. "You knew Reese, right?" she said, watching him carefully. "What do you think got him killed?" It was subtle, a flicker in his expression, the slightest shift in his posture. A crack so small most wouldn't have noticed. Then came the slip. "Reese was a stubborn bastard," Lasky muttered. "Thought he could clean up the place." The room went silent. Vale and Donnelly didn't move, didn't breathe. Lasky knew he had messed up. It was there in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his fingers curled into a fist against the table. He hadn't meant to say that. Before they could push him further, the gunshots rang out. Sharp, deafening, too close. Vale and Donnelly spun toward the door. From outside the interrogation room, voices shouted, boots pounded against the linoleum floors. Donnelly was the first to move. He yanked open the door, gun drawn. The hallway was chaos. Correctional officers scrambled for cover, yelling into radios. Down the corridor, by the security checkpoint, a figure lay sprawled on the ground. Ryan Calloway. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the fabric of his uniform. His hands were pressed tight against his side, fingers trembling as he tried to slow the bleeding. Vale rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. His breath was shallow, eyes flickering. He knew he was in bad shape, but he still tried to force out a few words. "They know," he coughed, wincing in pain. "They know you're here." His grip tightened weakly on Vale's wrist like he was trying to make her understand. Then his hand fell away. He was still breathing, but barely. Donnelly was already moving, sweeping the hallway with his gun. But whoever had fired those shots was already gone. No sign of the shooter. No trace. A warning. A clear message. They were being watched. Someone had allowed them to get this far, allowed them to pull at the edges of whatever Reese had uncovered. But now they were getting too close. Vale stood up, heart pounding, hands shaking with adrenaline. Lasky ... She turned, storming back into the interrogation room, but he was gone. The chair where he had been sitting was empty, the door slightly ajar. For a second, she just stared. He had been right there, minutes ago. Someone had gotten to him during the chaos of the shooting. A guard? A higher-up? Someone inside the prison itself? Vale felt a sinking dread settle in her stomach. Whoever was behind this? They had people everywhere. Calloway survived, barely. The bullet had missed anything vital, but it was close, too close. The kind of shot that wasn't meant to kill, just to send a message. And the message was clear. They were being watched. Someone inside Ironwood State Prison had eyes on them at all times. Someone powerful enough to pull strings, to orchestrate an ambush in the middle of an active investigation. A person like that didn't make empty threats. They made examples, and Calloway had almost been one of them. Vale and Donnelly knew they were running out of time. Reese had been getting close to something, too close. Whatever he had uncovered, it had been worth killing over. They needed to find out what before they ended up like him. They started with the contraband logs. Every prison had a black market: drugs, cell phones, cigarettes, weapons, items smuggled in and sold for insane amounts of money. But most of it was small time. Inmates and low-level guards making side deals. What Reese had stumbled onto had to be bigger. Digging through financial records, they found irregularities. Transactions that didn't make sense, money moving through offshore accounts, deposits made to shell companies with no clear owners. But one name stood out among the tangled mess. Carla Mendez. The same Carla Mendez who had been nervous when they first questioned her. The same one who had said Reese was getting too involved in things that weren't his business. She had never expected them to look at her. And now she was running. The request for emergency leave came in that morning. A sudden family crisis, she claimed, approved without hesitation. But Vale wasn't buying it. By the time they got to the airport, Mendez was already at the gate, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. No checked luggage, no traceable travel plans. A last-minute one-way ticket to Mexico. She wasn't coming back. When they cornered her, she didn't even try to fight, didn't demand a lawyer, didn't play innocent. She just sat down in a quiet interrogation room at the airport and broke. Reese had been right. There was a smuggling ring inside the prison. Not just small-time contraband, serious operations, drugs, weapons, high-value items moved in and out like ironwood was just another stop in a well-oiled system. And Lasky, he was right in the middle of it. But he wasn't alone. The name Mendez gave them made Vale's stomach turn. Warden Frank Salazar. The man who had brushed off Reese's murder as gang retaliation, the one who had shut down every attempt to investigate deeper. It had always been him. Mendez swore she hadn't killed Reese. She was just damage control, the cleanup crew. The real killer, Jack Lasky. And now he was gone. Vanished, disappeared the same night Calloway was shot. No one had seen him leave, but Vale knew the truth. He had help. Someone had opened a door for him. Someone had given him a head start. They weren't just dealing with a corrupt officer. They were up against a system built to protect itself. One moment, he was an officer sitting in an interrogation room, cornered with nowhere to go. The next, he had vanished without a trace. No footage of him leaving. No reports of an officer escorting him out. It was like he had never been there at all. But Vale and Donnelly knew better. Someone inside Ironwood State Prison had helped him slip through the cracks. Someone high enough to erase records, disable cameras, and make people forget they ever saw him. By morning, a BOLO was issued statewide. Every highway, every airport, every bus terminal was on alert. But Vale had seen this before. Lasky wasn't running blind. He had a plan, a network, people who would keep him hidden as long as he needed. Days passed. Nothing. Then the anonymous tip. A location, ... A cabin deep in the woods far from any main road. No security cameras, no neighbors for miles. The kind of place someone went when they didn't want to be found. By the time Vale and Donnelly arrived, SWAT was already in position. Black-clad officers crouched low, rifles trained on the door, waiting for the signal. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation. This wasn't a routine arrest anymore. This was a manhunt for a cop killer. They moved in, silent, precise. Vale's pulse pounded as the team reached the front door. The wooden planks creaked beneath their boots, the wind whistling through the trees. Then, a faint noise inside. Movement ... Someone was waiting. A signal was given. The door burst open. Gun up, Vale moved fast, sweeping her light across the cabin's dark interior. The place was small, just a single room, cluttered with half-packed bags, discarded food wrappers, a mattress in the corner. And in the middle of it all, Lasky. He stood by the window, his gun already raised. For a long second, no one spoke. His face was drawn, eyes bloodshot like he hadn't slept in days. There was no panic, no desperate attempt to fight or flee, just acceptance. It was never supposed to go this far, he muttered. His fingers flexed on the grip of his gun, but he didn't lift it any higher, didn't lower it either. Vale took a step closer. You should have stayed out of it, he sneered, voice hoarse. Then, a flicker of movement. The shift of his weight, the tightening of his grip, a decision. A gunshot rang out. Donnelly fired first. The impact threw Lasky back, his gun slipping from his fingers as he collapsed against the wooden floor. For a moment, the only sound was the wind outside. Then his breath hitched, one final sharp inhale, a slow, rattling exhale, and then nothing. Lasky was dead. The investigation didn't end with Lasky's death. If anything, it cracked open something far uglier. With nowhere left to run, Carla Mendez took the only deal she had left. She flipped, turned state's witness in exchange for a plea deal that would keep her out of a life sentence. The evidence she provided was damning. Wire transfers, smuggling routes, names, and at the top of the list, Warden Frank Salazar. Reese had uncovered a sophisticated contraband ring operating within Ironwood, run by none other than Warden Salazar, Carla Mendez, and Jack Lasky. Drugs, weapons, and illicit materials were being smuggled in and distributed with the cooperation of key prison officials. The operation was seamless. Certain inmates were allowed access to the goods in exchange for money funneled through offshore accounts. Guards who asked too many questions were either silenced or brought into the fold. Reese wasn't supposed to know. But he had started seeing patterns, unexplained inmate privileges, missing security footage, and shipments that never added up. He had compiled evidence, logging names and transactions in his missing notebook. And when he confronted Lasky about it, he unknowingly signed his own death warrant. Reese had backed Lasky into a corner. He demanded answers, threatened to go to internal affairs, and pushed too hard. That night in cell block C, Lasky had no choice. Reese had to be silenced. The attack was quick, brutal. One blow to the skull with a baton ended it. His radio was taken, his badge removed. The cameras were already off. Within minutes, it was over. The arrest was swift, too swift. A carefully orchestrated performance. Cameras rolling as Salazar was led out of his office in cuffs, his face stone cold, unreadable. They wanted to make it look like justice had been served, like the system had worked, like Ironwood State Prison had been cleaned up. But Vale had seen too much to believe in happy endings. The deeper they had dug, the more names had surfaced. Bureaucrats, politicians, prison officials, people with influence, people who should have stopped this long before Reese ended up in a pool of his own blood. But they hadn't. Because they had benefited. Because they had looked the other way. Salazar would take the fall, but that didn't mean the operation was over. If anything, someone else would step in to replace him. Calloway knew it too. He survived the bullet, but he wouldn't survive the weight of what he had learned. The prison, the brotherhood, the badge. None of it felt the same anymore. I don't want to end up like Reese. Those were the last words he said before he turned in his resignation. Donnelly understood. Vale did too. By the time they left Ironwood for the last time, the sun was setting behind the prison walls, stretching long shadows across the concrete. The place felt the same as it had the day they first arrived. Nothing had changed. One murder solved. But how many more go unnoticed? As they reached the gates, a heavy clang echoed behind them, the sound of steel locking into place. The gates of Ironwood State Prison slammed shut. Inside, the cycle continued.